Hey, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Today I have Jacob Slichter. Jacob is the author of So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, which recounts his time as a drummer with the band Semisonic. Well, part of his time. He's still the drummer of Semisonic. They had a huge hit at the turn of the century called Closing Time. And that was his song, his band song. And it's a great book. It's a great book if you're interested in the music industry, if you're interested in sort of what goes on behind the scenes, and what it's like to just kind of be in a rock band that suddenly blows up, that suddenly just has that hit. And it's a wonderful sort of outside the circle way of looking in at that life. And we also talk a lot about his creative writing practice, and we talk a lot about his philosophy on education because he's also a professor at Sarah Lawrence College in the writing department. And so here's my conversation with Jacob Slichter. Hey, Jacob.
Hey, how you doing, Eric?
Good. How are you?
Good, man.
Thanks for doing this.
Sure. How's the background here? I wonder if we're optimal. Maybe.
It's like a room.
Okay. Okay, good.
I had one yesterday where the author was in profile.
Oh, really? The whole time?
I don't think he wanted the light on him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a good conversation though, so that's all that matters.
Yeah.
How you been?
Good. How about you?
All right. I've honestly I've had more writing time this year than any other time in my life,
Yeah, that's there you go.
and I used it. I've always we were talking about this yesterday with Jan, my girlfriend, and she was saying that I've always managed to just no matter what was going on, be able to hunker down and get stuff done because my creative to do list has always been so massive.
Right.
So yeah, we're getting vaccinated. We're getting our first dose on Saturday.
I got mine today.
Nice.
Yeah,
So that's progress, I guess.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Are you still at the college?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm teaching undergrads this semester. I taught grads in the fall. That seems to be my pattern these days. Graduate MFA students in the fall and undergrads in the spring.
Are you going to the campus or is it virtual?
No, I'm all remote.
Oh, nice. So
So yeah.
yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, David Hollander was saying that he's been going to the campus occasionally.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, some people do. I don't know. If I didn't have diabetes, maybe I would.
Mm,
But I think that right now I'm just sort of taking no chances.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, the only reason I can get vaccinated tomorrow is because I'm an asthmatic.
Yeah,
I mean, that was my ticket.
yeah,
Rather not be an asthmatic, to be honest.
yeah.
Um, so I was not rereading your book entirely, but I was perusing it last night and this morning to brush up. Um, I love this book. I think this is the book musicians should read, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
Um, because there's a lot of, I've always just been a listener, and I've always been obsessed with radio stations, which makes sense why I would start a podcast. But just hearing, reading about the details of really what goes on, like this idea that you're crossing your fingers for like a programming director to, well, is he going to give us 10 spins a week or 30 or more?
Right.
I mean, that stuff is mind blowing because growing up, I always thought that, you know, listeners dictated what we listen to. That's not
Right.
the case at all.
No,
It's curated.
it's kind of a complicated formula. I mean, it's really different at each station, and I think what the listeners want is does actually factor in the catch being that what the listeners want is often what's familiar to them, so that the more an initial push is made for a single, the more they're sort of like trained their ears are sort of like attached to things that are familiar, so they want those things. So in the case of, say, Semisonic, um, we would spend or actually our record company would spend money that was our future earnings, which we never got, to get us onto the radio. Sometimes with success, and most of the time without success. But it was all, a sort of quasi legal, but basically illegal enterprise. The United States radio promotion game in the 1990s.
It's very much, to me, reminiscent of the kind of hustling that goes on here in Staten Island,
Uh huh.
where they're charging they're charging all of the like the real estate development and business startups on somebody else's dime, but there's almost never a guarantee that it's going to work out. I mean, the Ferris wheel that we were supposed to get. They invested in the land, they started the project, then it turns out, oh wait, the land can't hold a Ferris wheel that size. So then it just stopped. But
Right.
the whole budget they set aside for it is gone. Where'd it go? It's just, I don't know. There's something about the way the radio industry works. It just reminded me of just all the hustling that I see going on here. It really is a scam.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, we're here to talk about writing because April is National Poetry Month. So I've decided that I'm only going to feature writers. And rather than doing one a week, I'm going to do two a week. So I'm going to do one on Monday, one on Thursday. And I'm almost there. And so I figured I'm inviting all the writers that I know, at least the ones that I'm still in touch with. And then I'm also inviting writers I don't know. Yesterday, the one I recorded was with an author I'd never met before, but I grew up with. His name was Avi.
Mm-hmm.
He's a YA author, kind of responsible for getting me reading
Cool.
back in the day.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of bringing in people from all eras of life. Uh, but
Excellent.
yeah, one of the reasons I reached out to you was because you gave me feedback that really, on some of my work, that it really motivated me to keep experimenting, and I really appreciated that. And that was that you described it as jazz. You
Uh
described
huh.
something I wrote as jazz. I'm like, you know what? Fuck yeah, that's I can vibe with that. And so
Why was that motivating?
I think because I suffer from a complex where I feel like I need to conform my writing to some sort of structure
Mm,
that's digestible by as many people as possible.
right.
However, some of the best, most meaningful stuff that I come up with don't quite work in
Mm-hmm.
a typical three act structure with an arc at the latter half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, but I also tend to use my work to philosophize a little bit,
Uh huh.
especially about like the art life,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to work better if you can, rise and dip according to, what it feels like it should do, not a preconceived structure, I guess.
Right. Right. Right.
I hope I'm explaining that well.
Yeah, I get it. Um, I'm curious if you have any favorite jazz artists whose work, on the one hand, sort of defies traditional ideas about form, and yet, on the other hand, offers a kind of a model, a sort of a like something to shoot for.
I don't have a music model.
Okay.
I have writing models, and
Oh,
I
cool.
have models from the experimental film sector. So
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
think about like the avant-garde films that play in rotation at the Anthology Film Archives, like
Sure. Yeah.
Maya Deren,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that.
Cool.
Um, and also another author who actually I'm featuring in the same month as you. She just came out with her first novel, which is highly experimental. Her name is Loie, and one chapter will be written very much like you would expect a novel to be written. The next one might be in verse, but it's still part of the narrative. And then the
Uh-huh.
next one might be an essay, or it might be, it might read like a stage play.
Right.
And I'm sure she has all of the information that where it's informed at some level on her end, but
Right.
you really gotta just kind of embrace the next thing, whatever it is. And
Mm-hmm.
one chapter just might be a quarter of a page of just like it reads almost like a journal scribble, and
That's
I love
great.
that.
Yeah,
That's
that's
what
awesome.
inspires me, I think. Just and she was explaining it too, like she sees the blank page more as a canvas than anything else,
Oh, that's
which
interesting.
also vibes with me because I'm very much a visual artist, and I do think about words on the page visually rather than how they might sound,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably why I've never really been as passionate about the sentence as some of my peers were. Um, these are the things I've been reflecting on ever since I left the MFA program is
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. What have you been working on for
I've,
yourself?
got a second memoir that I've kind of might be at a sort of end point with. I'm gonna sort of see what a couple of folks say, and but I feel like it's definitely at a point where I don't have any ideas about more work to do on it. So maybe it's done. Um, and at some point I would love to write a. I've got some other books about drumming and other things that I would like to write. Um, Teaching is something I would like to write about. But I think I'm just sort of in a little bit of a coming to an end moment with one particular project, and then once I'm through that, then on to the next.
What are some what are some things about teaching that you think you might want to share?
Well, I think just the experiences of it. I think that the more I hear about how other people teach, the less weird what I do seems, because I think there are a lot of other people who are in sort of on parallel tracks to what I do, and we're all influenced. All of us share a number of influences, or are sympathetic to each other's influences. So it wouldn't be so much like here are my secrets as just memories of sort of particular discoveries that I made about teaching, about how it went better when I did this, or as opposed to that. So it wouldn't be a sort of coming down from the Mount Sinai of teaching book. It would be more just kind of like a book in which I share interactions, some sort of, I share memories of particular interactions with students about things.
Sorry. I have 8 cats,
Yeah.
and so they eventually will make an appearance. Um, Interesting. Okay, so uh, I want to read that book
Okay.
because I feel like you'll have an interesting perspective, and I also feel like um, your style was accessible in a way where, there's the cookie cutter way of teaching, but then there's also just whatever your mode is, we'll work with, and I feel like you vibed with that to a certain extent. Um,
Yeah, I think for me, it's always one of the challenges is I'm absolutely committed to that, and I want to do it in such a way where it's not just saying, where I'm actually giving the students something to push up against, because that's where I think the learning happens. So if I just say, okay, yeah, well, that's great. Well, that's great too. Well, it's all great. It's just great. You're great. We're great. The world is great. That doesn't, I think what helps a student is just being very honest about what happened when I read their work.
Yeah.
And also being willing to try doing it the way they want to do it. Because I think that for a few reasons. One is just like I'm really, I don't teach, I don't think of myself as an expert so much as someone who has a way of going about things that I offer other people into. So I don't consider myself like an expert on writing. I think that's, and in fact I'm kind of a little wary of people who sort of kind of think they are experts. Um, that just sort of brings up a lot of disturbing kinds of impulses in me when I think about somebody who has anointed themselves an expert about music or writing or art or something. I mean, some people really do have a lot of knowledge and they've read a ton, they've written a ton, and with that, with their experience comes a lot of insight, and I certainly wouldn't discount that. But I think one of the important things for me as a teacher is to make sure that students understand that my authority does not stem from expertise. Any authority I have simply stems from the fact that I show up and I work, and I'm there with them, and that's the authority I have. I'm the person who's there with them, and I'm a honest respondent to what they offer, and that's all the authority they may want from me, and that's basically all the authority I can offer.
Well, the measurement for me was whether or not I'm inspired to stay productive.
Hmm.
So it was really three professors there that inspired me to stay productive, which out of that comes developing the writing.
Hmm.
So it was you, David, and David. So it's two Davids and you.
Yeah, one of them
And
is a rock drummer. You got two
I
rock
know.
drummers
One of
and a
them,
guitar
another one's
player.
been a guitar player.
Yeah,
Yeah, all musicians, which I think might be a clue to something, an indicator
yeah,
of some sort that maybe I can unpack down the road. But um, yeah, and that was the thing too. Like if somebody, I mean, this was more a problem in I guess grade school and high school where there was a proper way to write,
sure.
but
Yeah,
when it comes to creative writing, um, nobody's really an expert. And everybody's can we're learning to how to create a practice, and we're learning how to kind of understand what works for us. It works for our voice, I guess, but there's no real expert. And I think that the people who understood that were the people I vibe with the most.
mm, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that one of the most important things that students need to hear is that them showing up to learn is a good thing. And that sounds so disappointingly new age and kind of squishy and feely and emotiony, but I think it's actually really true. Like, I think that a lot of people come into writing classes having being convinced that the way you learn in a creative writing class is you have a professor who's pouring himself scotch after scotch and he just rips the student work to shreds and then pours out his soul and tells them to be honest, and somewhere along the way a transformation takes place and they suddenly reach the depths of their soul and then they go on and win Pulitzers, and it's just not like that. um, I think that there's this sort of an assumption that a lot of students have, I think that learning and cruelty overlap, and I think there is actually zero overlap. I think that creativity and cruelty certainly coexist. I mean, there's a lot of people who have experienced and or give out cruelty who are creative people, but I think the creative process itself actually requires quite a bit of um, belief that you have the right to be there creating, and you have the right to make a mess, and you have a right to fuck it up and get it wrong, and a right to learn and improve, and a right to take as long as it takes to do that. And so that is, there's a kind of permission that people need to inhale that they largely deny themselves. I think that I often have the most difficult part of working with students is getting them to believe that I actually want them there writing, and I'm glad that they're in the class. I think that's like the hardest thing to convince students of. I think they largely think I'm bullshitting, and it can often take me like half the semester or more before they really start to believe that no, Jake actually is really glad that I'm here in his class. I don't know if that, sometimes I really wonder, like, do I have this kind of scowly look? I think, like, if anything, I have kind of like a little bit of a furrowy eyebrow, like worried look. But whatever it is, I think it's largely like past classroom experiences. I think people come in and they they are afraid of learning. They're afraid of the classroom, especially creative classroom.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of damage done initially by the education system where, I mean, I had no idea how much fun I would have in some of these workshops because of past experiences. There's a PTSD almost.
Well, it is. Yeah.
Have you ever seen that movie about that psycho drum teacher?
Yeah, whiplash.
Whiplash.
It's interesting because I think I'm a drummer, so a lot of people recommended it to me. And I think some of them thought it was a movie about drumming. And I think other people thought it was a sort of coming of age movie. And really, it's a horror movie.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know what percentage of the people who saw and liked the movie actually thought of it as a horror film, which is exactly what I think it is. I think it's a film about a protagonist who is gradually turned into the kind of monster that his teacher is. Um, it certainly has nothing to do with drumming. I mean, like the drummers everywhere went off on how, like bleeding while you're playing the drums. No, That's not how you drum. You know, like the best drumming movie of the big movies of the last 10 years, I think, was Birdman, which featured Antonio Sanchez, who's one of the great living drummers. I mean, he's really, I would, I might say he's my favorite of the sort of next generation of, jazz drummers. But that movie, he appeared at several key moments in Birdman and playing the drums live. He did the music score. It was just him drumming. He was robbed of an Oscar nomination, by the way. But
I'm gonna link to it so people will check it out. We'll
yeah,
drive some traffic, make it a cult thing.
it's just really great. And afterwards I went down and tracked down his recordings, and of course I'm way behind because everybody in the jazz world knows who he is, but he's amazing. But Birdman was the drumming movie, and Whiplash was a horror movie. Exactly, I think because of the instincts you had about bringing it up when I was talking about cruelty. Because that just was like a really a perfect picture of what a cruel teacher does, not only to the main character but actually to everybody else in that classroom.
Yeah. It. I feel like the the best teachers are the ones that inspire, um, which he did not. He did not successfully
No.
inspire anybody.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, that was one of the films we watched. The first, I don't know if it was a craft class or a workshop, but one of the first classes that I had in that program was a screenwriting class, and that was one of the films we had to watch. And we mirrored it with Black Swan. There's a lot of parallels between that and Black Swan, the Natalie Portman movie.
Yeah, which I never saw. I'm sorry to say. I
Yeah,
hear it's great.
it's Darren Aronofsky. So if you're used to that kind of gritty
Gotcha.
filmmaking,
Okay.
yeah. Um, but that's performing arts. But there's still like a component of like the teacher not really emphasizing the spirit of creation.
A nice contrast. There are many great contrasts. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is the Hobart Shakespeareans, which is a documentary about a grade school teacher in Los Angeles who has his fifth graders perform a Shakespeare play every year. And he just brings out of them such inspiration and energy and life. It's just wonderful to see. Um, what I was about to now it has slipped out of memory. There was another film I was going to mention. Maybe I'll think of it as we go. But yeah, the Hobart Shakespeareans was just a great picture of like a teacher who gets the students to surprise themselves, which I think is just wonderful. Like when a student can be surprised at what they're capable of doing, then you know you're in the room with a great teacher. I think like one thing that I think great teachers, I think that I don't think of myself as a teacher so much as like, or I don't think of what I do so much as teach as to facilitate learning.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like some slight, a subtle but important difference. I think like I'm not in the room sort of telling them, here's how you do it, and you do it this way, and blah blah blah. More like I'm trying to awaken their learning, and that's especially conducive to working with students on the kind of writing they want to do, and each of them has their own kind of learning that they want to do and their own kind of writing. So that allows me, that kind of approach allows me to sort of, like, for instance, if Eric Norcross shows up and shows me his work, and I say, okay, it seems like this has like you got sort of this is jazz, and think of this way, and what if it were, and what would you do, and just sort of try and give each writer a framework from which they can sort of extrapolate and keep learning. Because I think really what you want to do as a teacher is teach people how to learn,
Yeah.
so that the power of your work with them will then continue long after they are in the classroom with you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that goes in with sort of, and it's almost exactly with what Brian Morton had said in one of his talks about the mission of the MFA program is to help you create and sustain a writing practice, and that totally goes in with that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. Brian is like my Yoda. He's like, he's definitely such a huge influence on me. Not just his ideas, but his way of being. I mean, if you so Brian Morton, for those who don't know, is a novelist. Is a great novelist, and he was the director of the MFA program. Now but he still teaches. He's sort of stepped down from that role so he can do more teaching. He teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence. He's a fiction teacher, but he's one of these people where just watching him interact with other people gives you sort of like a whole thought about how teaching might go. It's surprising. He's got a kind of a really arresting combination of wisdom and generosity in his posture and in what he has to say, so that just being around him kind of makes you into a better version of yourself. I don't know of any other way to say it, but that's very much he has that kind of an effect, and I definitely feel myself as a teacher always sort of like thinking about what Brian Morton would do.
What would Brian Morton do?
Yeah,
It's going to be a T-shirt.
yeah.
Um, yeah, there was something you said earlier about. Oh boy, I wish I was taking notes. Oh, it'll come back to me. Low stakes, low stakes. You know what scene I think about a lot from your book? Um, I haven't really, I don't really do introductions anymore, but you wrote this book. So you
Yeah.
want to be a rock and roll star? Listen now to what I say. Copyright. I can't go further than that. Um, there's a scene early on at a rest stop McDonald's, which
I
to
knew you were
me,
going there. Yeah.
yeah, to me that's the cinema. That's where the cinema starts. You know, if this
Uh-huh.
was going to be adapted, I'd start with that scene,
Uh-huh.
and because I just love the, you know, I can see it like somebody's getting their food, and you know they're part of the band because you've seen the trailer, and then he walks in and his bandmates are all on different tables, and I can almost see it framed. I can see it framed in almost the way that Wes Anderson might frame one of his awkward shots, you know, on a
Uh-huh.
wide 25 millimeter lens.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but there's also like just nobody told you. No, there's this thing that gets under my skin. Nobody told you that they were going to eat alone. You
That
had
they were going to
to
eat
you had
alone.
that they were going to eat alone. You had to guess it. You had to see. You had to experience it.
I mean, there was a lot of that about being on the road. I think that so for those who haven't read the book, this is just what we're talking about, a scene early in my book, which is a memoir about my life as a rock drummer with the band Semisonic. And on the first road trip we took, I was in a band with two musicians who had been in a band that had toured widely, and with their sound man. Our sound man had been on all of those tours, so I was with three touring rock tour uh, veterans, and I was a rookie. Not only was I a rookie, I was at this point like 31 years old. Um, so, you know, old. And we pulled into the first fast food place we saw on our way out of Minneapolis, and it was about 90 miles south. We were going to Omaha, so we had a 6-hour drive. So we about 90 minutes out, we pull over to get food. We're in a McDonald's, and I was the last in line. And when I walked into the dining room with my tray of food, I noticed that each of the other three people had claimed their own private table. And it had occurred to me, oh, that's what we're doing. We're we're protecting each other. We're giving each other space. And it took me a while to figure out why that was. And then I really understood. It's because if you're cooped up in a Ford Econoline van, or frankly, even a tour bus, and you're in radio stations and then in dressing rooms and on stage and loading equipment in and out together, like you spend the vast portion of your day with these other people. You don't have any time to yourself. So any moment you have a moment where you can grab it for yourself, you take it. Even if that means at McDonald's you sit at your own private table, and then half an hour later you all look up and decide it's time to get moving, and you go. So yeah, it was. But that was how it went for me. It was a very steep learning curve because everybody else I was working with had been up that curve, and so I had to catch up really quickly.
Did did they all read that book?
Oh yeah, I made sure they read it before it was published
Oh, that was
because
nice.
I wanted I wanted to make sure that it wasn't gonna. I wanted to make sure it was true and right, and that that it felt right to them.
Yeah. I I tend to get a lot of flack from people I know who, as much as I try to disguise them in my books, they know it's them, and I don't ask permission. So you're very kind, much kinder than me.
I mean, the butt of all the jokes in the book was the narrator. So, it was me. So, there wasn't really, it wasn't like I needed their permission so much as just like, you're going to become a character in a book. I think you have a right to kind of, or if you're going to be a character in my book, I feel like you have a right to sort of maybe see yourself there, especially if you're not a person who signed up to be in a book.
Mm. You're the first writer to stand your ground in that. I swear everybody doesn't. Most people don't give a shit, and that
Yeah.
it's nice to have somebody on here who does. Um, True kindness. Um, I remember what you had mentioned. You were talking about surprise and the nature of surprise, and that comes up a lot too in some of these conversations, not just in writing, but just in creation in general. And that's this idea that if you're not surprised by it, why are you doing it? If you're not surprised by it, your reader won't be surprised by it. If you're not
Hmm.
surprised by it,
Yeah.
retool it.
Right.
And that's become my thing. My philosophy too is I have to be surprised by it if it's going to have a sort of longevity in my mind. That was, I don't know if you know this, but my film production last summer was the first production back when New York lifted restrictions on film companies.
Oh, well.
And I shot a feature film in July with minimal cast, no crew. I did everything. Um, and but the rule was we have this outline and we have some scenes written, but for the most part, I want to be surprised. Like in the editing room, I want to look at this footage and be like, wow, I couldn't have imagined that this is what we would come up with. And because my previous experience prior to my MFA, I shot a film that way, and it ended up being the film that I never got sick of. Like I previously, I'd always get sick of my work. I'd get sick of watching it. Um, and I find that the more surprised I am by my work, the more accessible it is in the long haul. There's a longevity to it in my mind. And so that's one of the things that I advocate for with people who want to be creative is try not to map out too many of the details.
I mean, it's a music thing, I remember once my bandmate John, we were talking about Joni Mitchell's album Chord and Spark. And I remember he said, everything on this album sounds so discovered. Like, it's just everything is just like new and a revelation. And no matter how many times you hear it, a particular chord change might just always be kind of surprising. And I was like, yeah, there is something really wonderful when it feels discovered.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It sounds discovered. It reads discovered.
Yeah.
It feels discovered. Um, yeah, I might integrate that into the title of this episode.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've seen previews for movies, surely, where you're like, well, that I know everything but the last 5 minutes of that movie.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, are they going to choose the happy or the sad ending? I don't know. But like, or on the tables of bookstores. This is more like 10 years ago, but there would always be books like Over Conclude Nation, how the habit of concluding has turned us into a nation of over concluders. And then you don't even have to read it. I mean, you read the blurbs on the back, you got the whole idea of the book. Um, or Darwin's Piano, the new evolution, the brain, and the new neuroscience of making music. I mean, you kind of already know the chapter outline of this book before you even see it. So I mean, these aren't actual books, but or
I
I made
understand.
up a fake memoir title, which was Tea for Two, a year of drinking the other caffeinated beverage, and you just kind of, I think what amused me about all of these sort of like ideas, these sort of like fake book ideas, is that what they all held in common is they promised exactly zero surprises. You knew exactly what was coming.
Yeah. Um, that's why I wait. I usually wait until the conversation is transpired before I figure out what the thesis of each episode is. And I think we're on it. But my placeholder was our podcast has finally arrived,
Oh yeah, that's great.
which is also you guys got to read this book. Read this book. I'll link to it. You'll get some of these jokes. um, are you still? When we last saw each other, I found out fairly late that you and I have a common acquaintance, Doug Halsey.
Oh yeah,
Right?
I used to play in a band with Doug. I don't anymore. But I see he's someone I follow on social media, and I love his organization, Ready for Rescue, which is a great uh, group of folks who rescue animals, especially animals that are sort of like in really bad medical conditions and things like that, and they find homes for them and help raise money for their medical procedures and things like that. But no, I don't play music with Doug, but I had a great time doing it when I did.
Mm.
And Semisonic, my band, is still making records. We put out an EP this fall, and we're gonna do some more recording as soon as we're past this pandemic, or at
Good.
least in a place where we can start flying around and seeing each other and being in the same room and recording together. So,
How
still
are
making music.
how are you guys handling? I mean, back in the late '90s, certainly the recording industry was structured differently than it is now on the business
Hmm.
side.
Yeah,
Has anything changed for you guys
I don't even
with
know
like
how it works
Spotify?
quite
Yeah.
honestly, but I do know that radio is nowhere near as big a piece of the puzzle as it used to be, but it still is. I mean, we were really like the first single off of our EP that came out this fall. The EP is called "You're Not Alone," and the title track was the first single, and you know we followed it all the way up to number 12 on the AAA charts. Which was fun to do. And then there's the whole sort of world of Spotify and streaming and playlists and playlist influencers and all of that, and it's so far beyond me. I have no idea how it works, and actually, I don't have any interest in knowing. Not
Hmm.
that I dismiss it or think it's not worth knowing about, but it's just I have limited time, so I just haven't figured that out. There are much smarter people in our in Semisonic's little world that who know how to do all that, and I just kind of leave it to them.
Yeah, and it'll probably all change in 5 years anyway. So
Yeah, really good.
um, it seems like when a normality is established in any business, especially a tech-oriented business, and music has become a tech-oriented business, um, the normality sticks for about 3 years, and then there's a whole other shift. Um, I mean, I still think of smartphones as new, but they're not new anymore. Like they're
Right,
old.
right. I don't think of smartphones as new, but I do am ever more surprised when things can only be done on a smartphone. Like you can't download the computer version of it.
Oh yeah.
You can only do it on your smartphone, and I just like shrinking my, I sort of learned to shrink my thinking down to being, like this big, but now it's got to be like this big. So, it's just hard. It's my my okay boomer brain just doesn't work that well with like, just small screens and only being able to see this much.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's just a boomer thing. I mean, I remember having an old late 80s Apple dinosaur where you could play Oregon Trail and maybe a couple other games, and that was it.
Uh, uh-huh.
I was just watching a video about base code. Do you remember base? It
No.
was like back in the late 70s, early 80s, base was how kids coded, learned to code.
Was it the precursor to BASIC?
Basic. Yeah, that's the name of it.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the same stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
BASIC, I remember.
yeah, and they would get these tech magazines where the code would literally be printed out, and you'd have to like for
Transcribe it.
hours on end transcribe
Yeah,
the code just to get the game, and it would be like a simple game that
yeah,
took hours to code.
yeah. That's really funny.
Yeah, I love that video because it's just
Yeah.
like, oh my god, throwback. Um, yeah, well, I mean, what's your writing practice look like? How are you balancing that with your zooms and?
I try to, I mean, I think with my writing practice, I think the thing is that the key for me, I think what creativity requires is uh, relaxation. Like in an analog, there's a physical analog in music making. In order to drum, for instance, like the reason Whiplash, the movie, was so wrong-headed is it showed him tensing up and exerting himself. And actually, what you've really got to do with drumming is to learn how to relax into it and get out of your own way. And there's a sort of similar sort of spiritual, psycho-spiritual battle that writers face, and actually battle's the wrong word because battle makes us think that what we have to do is fight. And actually, what the challenge is that we have to learn how to relax into writing. So the way I do that is I just set a very low threshold for what my daily writing output can be. And if I hit that, I can stop, or I can keep going, but I can stop, and then I've done my duty for the day, as it were. And what I find that does is it just helps me to, it gets me in the habit of starting, which I think if you talk to 20 writers, 17 or more of them would say the hardest part about writing is starting.
I agree with that. Um,
So, but I think that one of the reasons that starting is hard is because people think that they're starting for a 2 hour writing session, and that just the thought of that just feels awful. But if they told themselves they were starting for only 15 minutes, they'd find that they were able to do that. And then of course, they feel bad about stopping after 15 minutes. But of course, if you did 15 minutes a day, for 40 days, that's 10 hours. It adds up. And not
yeah.
only that, if you write every day, you start to make connections in between your writing sessions. You're at the waiting for the your coffee order to come up, or you're, in a left turn lane that's endless, or you're doing something other than writing, but because you did do a little bit of writing that day and you're going to do a little bit of writing the next day, you suddenly get an idea about a little move you could make, or a little thing that you want to add or write about, or an insight about how to connect things that felt hard to connect. So regular light engagement is, for me, is the key. And then, of course, you can just keep going. So like most days when I'm writing, I go for hours, but I do always tell myself I can stop after 15 minutes, and I do the same with drumming. Like most days, I drum for 90 minutes, but I tell myself like 15 minutes and I'm good.
Is how many do you have multiple project work in progress projects going on at the same time?
I probably will soon. I think right now, just because I'm at this ending point with this second book, it's kind of hard to sort of, I want to get it across the finish line, so I'm very focused on that. But I think the minute I do, then I might actually start a couple of things.
I want to read. I want to read your teaching book. I think you should get that going.
Okay, good. Will do.
That's a directive. No.
Okay.
Low stakes, low stakes. Um, I have to keep reminding myself, otherwise I fall into this. I fall into a panic pattern if I don't have a bullet point or a way to keep a conversation going because um, this is part of this podcast is to make sure that I is to exercise this conversational I don't know gift that other people seem to have, which I don't consider myself particularly good at, and so I have to keep saying low stakes, Eric, low stakes, you know. Um, but
Well, I think maybe also, I think we frame a lot of what we do in the world as performance. And I try for myself to frame it as learning.
mm, that's
So that
interesting.
if I'm engaged in something, to not focus on nailing it,
Yeah,
just to pay attention.
that's healthy.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time.
We don't want to take up too much of your listeners' and viewers' time.
Oh, I do.
Okay. Well, you do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who knows? Maybe they have a 2 hour commute, but they
Yeah.
probably don't these days. Anyway, yeah, I find that if we find the sweet spot between 45 minutes to 55 minutes, they'll listen to the whole thing. Anything more, they won't. So
Okay.
um, I guess we can wind this down. I think we got some good stuff. We got some inspirational stuff. Um, and we got some new books coming from you. And so I look forward to. I hope that you come on again so we can talk about your
Okay.
next one.
Cool. Yeah. I would love that.
Um, your book is for right now. Your book is So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, and I'll link to it. I'll also link to everything we've mentioned here. That
Cool.
way, there's an intact discourse, and I'll cut this part out so we can jump to. Thank you, Jacob. Nothing was cut. It was perfectly intact.
Awesome.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you,
man.
Eric.
Bye.
Okay, man. Bye bye.
And that was my conversation with Jacob Slichter. I hope you guys found it useful and entertaining. And thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys on the next episode. Bye. Hello. Thank you for visiting my podcast on YouTube. My podcast is really important to me. It's something that I really intend to grow over the next couple of years. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what I can do with it and where I can go with it. And as a creator, having these discussions with other artists is really important to me in terms of helping me understand my voice and place in the creative sphere, but also just to sort of remind myself that this is a community. This isn't just like me against the world. And I hope that you're getting that too. And one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is to expose as many people as possible to the insights that have been acquired by people who are spending their lives creating. Some of them are professionals, some of them just do it for the self. But all of it matters. All of these discussions matter. They matter to something. They count to something. But here's the thing: is this is for the most part, an out-of-pocket endeavor. So we're looking to sort of start garnering outside support, sometimes in the form of underwriter, like advertising. That's hard to do when you're a young podcast. And it tends to go episode by episode. What we're looking to do is create a more sustainable model. Um, that way we can make this podcast free all the time. And it is free. It's free on audio platforms. It's free on YouTube. Sometimes you got to contend with ads. But for the most part, it's consumed free. And so to keep it free, we have to have some sort of other revenue stream. And so what I've decided to do is dedicate my Patreon account exclusively to the financing of this podcast. So if you're interested in being a part of keeping this podcast alive, I would urge you all to go to my Patreon and become a subscriber. Patreon, I mean, you probably know what it is, but in case you don't, it's basically helps facilitate the subscription and financing of the independent arts. So you could help finance an artist, a writer, a podcaster, or somebody who does all of it. I actually do all of it. Um, the thing is, though, my Patreon is exclusively for the podcast because I believe in the mission of the podcast, and I believe in the mission of telling telling artists stories, telling the stories of entrepreneurs, telling the stories of success, telling the stories of failure. All of that is so vital. And that's basically it. Yeah, and you know, if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. But if it is your thing, and if you want to see more, if you think I'm kind of onto something here, please think about visiting my Patreon and becoming a patron of this podcast. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next episode.